Thank you, Mayor and members of the council. We brought before you tonight two draft ordinances worked up by the Turlock Police Department. The first one addresses enhances the unlawful camping ordinance of the city, which currently prohibits unlawful camping on city property by adding prohibitions on unlawful camping near locations where children congregate, namely daycare centers, schools, and playgrounds. So it amends the appropriate municipal code sections to change those. We'd like input on both of these ordinances. Some of the questions on the first one is the 600-foot requirement appropriate, and are there other land uses that should be listed other than the three mentioned? So those are sort of the questions there. The second suggested approach recognizes that a vibrant downtown business district relies upon unobstructed sidewalks during business hours. And so when those are obstructed, it has an adverse operation and interferes with the operation of the business. So the draft ordinance prohibits obstruction of commercial sidewalks during certain specified times that would interfere with what are essentially extended business hours of the operation from opening to closing, typical opening and closing times. And we also would like input on this ordinance. It's drafted in a manner where all of downtown would be covered. So we've included a map of the downtown area with the different sub-districts in downtown. It may be more appropriate to not cover the entire downtown, because the premise of the ordinance is the concentration of businesses and the lack of parking that you would have at a shopping center create a unique or an enhanced need for the sidewalks to be available to the businesses. And so that's the concept there. Both of these were a result of the public meetings on homelessness that the city manager facilitated on September 22nd and October 4th of last year. We had many
citizens
express a desire for the city to pay more attention to issues about what I'll call the quality of life impacts of the unsheltered homelessness issue we have here. And so these are in a response to that. So I'll just leave it at that, and we're happy to answer any questions. And I don't know if the chief has separate questions, or at least is available for questions or comments.
Questions for staff?
I do. So, Mr. Petrolakis, can you help clarify that even if these ordinances went into effect tomorrow, or at any time in the near future, that we would still be limited by federal case law on enforcing them because of the lack of day centers, navigation center, transitional housing, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it's mentioned at the end of the report that even with new ordinances, you still have to abide by the largely federal case law that governs this area, that's laid out many factors that a community would have to follow to actually enforce their ordinances, which means issuing either administrative citations or infraction citations, that sort of thing. So that is true, that you don't necessarily get to enforce these more than you can enforce other things. They both have a different quality in that a lot of the case law is about the general prohibitions that cities have, including Turlock, that says you can't obstruct with sidewalks all over town. Or you can't, like I mentioned, you can't camp on public property. And so what's a little bit different about these is they have a geographic component, and the downtown one also has a time component. And so I think that they're probably more enforceable than blanket prohibitions, but I don't want to raise community expectations too high, because it becomes a very fact-intensive analysis of, whether you can or can't enforce. And I think I'm a broken record at this point. I think that the enforcement issue largely revolves around what the federal courts have said, which is what kind of capacity do you have in your community as to shelter beds, and how does that match up with your homeless population?
Do we have comments too, or are we going to go questions?
We can't comment until.
Question, and I've already had this question answered in my email, but I wanted it to be a public question so everyone can understand my thought process too. So, not George, sorry, City Attorney Petrolakis.
George is fine. I'll respond.
Why are we specifically putting this to downtown only and not having this be a citywide ordinance? Because I'm getting a little pushback in my district as far as why is downtown getting something that we wouldn't be getting, because people sleep on the sidewalks and in front of doorways all over town, and I have a lot of commercial in my district.
Yeah, no, that's very understandable. I think that the way this ordinance is drawn, it is particular to a concentrated business district without parking that especially relies on the sidewalks to get from one location to another. So the way it's written, it has that limitation because that is what probably makes it, let me see how many weaselly words I can use, probably makes it a little more enforceable. The more you expand it, the more you just get to what's already on the books, which is a general prohibition of obstructing with city right-of-way or sidewalks. And that, so the broader that is, I think the more a court is going to look at that under the case law concepts that, you know, we've discussed a few times that make those very hard to enforce unless you've addressed the other side of the ledger, which I mentioned earlier.
My concern with this, and I'm not,
Question?
I mean, my question about this?
Yeah.
Okay. Back to Ms. Abrams' point about not having a place for them to be it, you know, low barrier shelter, transition, whatever you want to call it.
Can I add on to your question?
Please.
Okay. Mr. City Manager, is it not true? I sound like an attorney, double negative. Is it true that at the next meeting, you're going to bring forward a lease agreement so that we would be having a day center almost immediately?
We're in discussions with the United Samaritans Foundation. They have some vacant office space just down the street here on Broadway. They've been productive discussions, and my expectation is that we'll be able to present to you a lease arrangement with them to make that space available on a day center basis to homeless. We're also in discussions with another not-for-profit provider here in the town that would operate that facility. So we need to get those two things in place. My expectation is we'll be able to do that by the next council meeting.
And then, Mr. Petrolakis, this is not an ordinance reading today, so when would, if it were to pass, when would it come into effect?
You know, there was a Modesto city attorney when I started my career who was very senior, and when he would get nervous in answering his questions, he would do this a lot. So that's going to be my tell.
That's your tell.
You know?
Yeah.
Or it's interesting question.
Yeah, so yeah, well, no.
30 days, is that right?
Yeah, I don't remember your
Leading the
question.
witness.
When would it be effective? Yeah, it would be effective, but this is kind of a sliding scale thing to go back to. You know, it depends on how robust the effort is to add day center facilities to emergency shelters that don't currently have a day capacity. So that is an important step to at least making the city attorney's office more comfortable with enforcement. It's not everything, but it's an important piece. And so it makes enforcement more likely, in my opinion, depending on what the facts are and how many, really how much capacity you're getting in the day centers at each day center. Because what the courts are going to do, they're going to analogize to the focus has been on shelter beds at night. But here, if you want to enforce during the day, clear to me, they're going to analogize to that and look at your capacity of your day centers, right? So without day center capacities at our emergency shelters, I think it's pretty difficult to make much progress on actually enforcing your community standards as reflected in the municipal code. So it's an important step. But again, I don't want to raise expectations too much that anything's a magic bullet, because it's a complicated issue to get to the enforcement. And we are working. I mean, everyone's. We got the other thing at the other land that the city manager's working on, right? About and so there's a lot going on, and so we're trying to figure out how we can work on our community standards as we ramp up the capacity.
Did I help?
Yeah, I just want to ask the city manager.
Oh, you go.
What do you anticipate the capacity of that day center to be?
I'm projecting that it's going to be somewhere around between 40 and 50 people. And then, as the city attorney mentioned, there's another project, day center project ongoing with the Turlock Gospel Mission. And that should provide, and Katie can help me out here, probably another 60 to 80 beds, or 80 slots. For day use, yeah. So we're talking 120, 130.
Go ahead.
I have another question regarding camping. As I was, trying to read through how these changes would interplay with the rest of that section in the ordinance, and does having personal belongings with you, if it includes camp paraphernalia, constitute camping? And to contextualize a little bit, I'm just concerned with the interplay of these two ordinances as they're written, if we wouldn't get ourselves in a situation where there's really no legal place for individuals to be.
So the way the camping ordinance is written, I think the way that's going to be applied is that if you're using camping paraphernalia, that's part of what makes it unlawful under our code. So I'm not sure just having it would do so. And then your second point, if I'm understanding it, is a good point, because I think if a city, let me think, if a city, it's kind of funny, because if a city passed a whole bunch of ordinances that the net effect of which was to allow no place for an unsheltered homeless person to be, am I getting that so far, kind of? By doing these carve-outs, I mean, you could end up kind of in the same place that you are now, which, the difference between that and the broad prohibitions that aren't necessarily enforceable now based on what the federal courts say, right? So I'm not sure, so if you did that, if there was some sort of scheme to do that, I think that, that would be a juicy target for somebody, to go after who likes these things. But I think that, so let me stop there, because I want to make sure I'm understanding it.
I would ask, how do we define camping gear?
Yeah, and so camp paraphernalia is, well, it says in there, all of these different things.
Yeah, and that's already in our code. So, I suggest you should ask a camper, because your city attorney isn't going to really know. But it says tarpaulins, cots, beds, sleeping bags, hammocks, or non-city designated cooking facilities and similar equipments, meaning you're not using, I don't know if you have barbecues at your parks or something. That's kind of what it at least implies. And camp facilities means tents, huts, or temporary shelters.
I guess my question was just going, so the part of the ordinance, or the part of the ordinance that's not in the packet but is in the municipal code goes on to 5-20-3 about storage of personal property in public spaces, and it relates to camping and camp paraphernalia. So I'm curious if, someone was trying to comply with the downtown ordinance, the prohibition of being there, and then move to Broadway Park, for example, which is just right outside of the mapped area, would they have no place to go that's not private property and public property that surrounds these sensitive areas? Maybe we can't answer that right now, but I'd like to
I'm trying
know
to-
on,
Can you
looking at it.
state it one more time? I want to make sure I get it. Or if you're like me, you won't be able to, which is okay too. I'll look at the tape.
Are we creating a system or just a scenario with the interplay of these two ordinances as they're written, where someone who's trying to comply with the commercial sidewalk ordinance and then moves to, for example, Broadway Park as another public space that might not be, and has their gear, that includes camping paraphernalia, would they not be able to be in that public space and such that there's no real public space or private space to be?
I guess I think so we're talking about commercial sidewalks now, or the 600-foot, both?
How they work together.
I think the 600-foot additions for facilities where children or youngsters congregate, what that probably means right now is it would allow the Turlock Police Department to, if they saw that situation, it probably would mean that they could encourage people not to be within 600 feet of the sensitive use. I don't think on its own it's going to allow us to do enforcement, otherwise, right? I don't think it's going to change and maybe I'm not thinking about it right. Maybe you're thinking about the playground definition, right? And does that sort of take out? Yeah. So that's a fair point that I hadn't thought of, which is maybe we ought to look at. Maybe we ought to chart that, because the playgrounds are recreational play areas, right? So I actually don't know how that interplays with your parks, right? So you're asking me, does it wipe it all out in a way, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
I'm sure someone from staff
Yeah.
could help me out, but I don't know if there's a playground in every
Yeah.
park. I don't think there is, but many. And so
Yeah.
are we effectively wiping
Yeah.
out every park and every sidewalk,
Yeah.
every place to be?
Yeah. Okay, I'll look at that
I have a
before we bring
question
it back.
for city manager. Do we know, is Turlock Gospel Mission allowing their storage building to be utilized by the homeless now?
After a minor correction, that is now the case. So there is storage.
So now we have storage available for anyone?
Well, for as many as the storage facilities can hold. Yes.
Right. Okay, thank you.
More questions? And are there any comments or direction for staff?
Yeah, I do have some specific comments on the ordinances themselves. First, for the commercial sidewalk ordinance, I'm a little concerned that it's written too broadly, particularly the no person shall sit or lie on a commercial sidewalk. I would rather see the ordinance be more narrowly tailored to the issue of obstructing the sidewalks, and maintaining public access to sidewalks and buildings and driveways, fire hydrants, etc. I think, as it stands, prohibiting sitting or lying in public I don't think we can prevent, I don't think we should prevent people from being in public spaces, whether or not they choose to sit or lie there, whether or not they have their belongings or not, if they are not inhibiting the access of someone else. So I think it should be our community standard to allow members of the public to access public spaces so long as they are not inhibiting anyone else from enjoying that public space as well. And as it regards to camping, I would think it would be instructive to see if we, what areas we are prohibiting, specifically with the 600 feet from sensitive areas, to really be sure that we understand what areas people can be in, because I don't envy staff and the city for all of the narrow path forward between all the different competing ideas on how to handle this, and ordinances are one part of it. I would like us to see us make significant progress on what can be done where people can go.
Any other comments or suggestions for staff?
Yeah, my comment would be, as I discussed before, that I would like to see this citywide and not just downtown, because businesses in my area still have the same issue with people sleeping in their on their sidewalks and in their doorways, and both front and back of the businesses, and specifying one area over another just doesn't quite seem fair to me. So that would be my comment.
Anything?